Mr. Speaker.
Eugenie Sage.
Tanakwe, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm pleased to take a call on the Conservation Natural Heritage Protection Bill and its second reading, and that's not just because the Green Party supports the bill, but also because it has been a very pleasant change in terms of the way in which Select Committee works and the way in which the Parliament works, where we've had on this bill such cross-party agreement on how we improve the protection for our common natural and historic heritage, the Indigenous species and wild places in New Zealand. And it's a rare bill too because it received only 8 submissions. They were virtually all in support, and because for a change the Select Committee listened to submitters and was actually able to make changes to the bill which put in place some of the suggestions that they made about improvements. And certainly commend Rob Burgoyne in his submission, because it was him that pointed out that the penalties in the Marine Mammals Protection Act hadn't been updated since at least 1996, and that they had been significantly eroded by inflation. And so that's why we had the change that Marion Street has talked about, that she took up to make those penalties consistent. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about productive tinkering with conservation legislation rather than making any substantive changes, and that's one of the reasons we support it. It doesn't create any new offences, and it simply creates a more consistent and a more up-to-date penalty regime across the Conservation Act, the National Parks Act, the Reserves Act, the Wildlife Act, the Wild Animal Control Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Acts. But as Charles Chauvel noted at the first reading, it is a bit strange that parliamentary time has to be used to do this, and there's not some mechanism to provide that financial penalties increase in line with inflation. But, Mr. Speaker, it is a good bill because we had that cross-party agreement and because it should encourage compliance with conservation legislation. And like others, would certainly like to acknowledge Jackie Dean for the work she did in developing it, and the Chair of the Select Committee, Nikki Wagner, and also the officials from the Department of Conservation, Select Committee and Parliamentary Council. And it's a useful bill because the existing penalties in those 6 pieces of legislation are old and they're often very low. The penalties in the Reserves Act, for example, hadn't been updated since 1977, and where you get low penalties, that often suggests to the courts that the offences are minor or trivial. And indeed, in some of the wildlife smuggling cases, the courts had asked that the penalties be increased because they had been somewhat frustrated by the small penalties that they were able to have access to. And where you've got laws that were passed by the Parliament at different times, they've got different levels of penalty and they're inconsistent. And there's an example where you've got, if someone felled a single tree in a national park, which of course are our premier protected areas, that would be liable to a fine of $2,500, whereas if that tree was in a conservation area, the fine would be $10,000. That doesn't make sense, so the bill makes sure that there's consistency. And it also means that if you've got low penalties, there's no deterrent, because the fine is less than the benefits that are gained, and that's particularly with the issue of wildlife smuggling, where with species like gecko, smugglers have been able to get very lucrative returns internationally for smuggling, and they've only been faced with a small fine in New Zealand. And one of the important things that the bill also does, as Nikki Wagner pointed out, was it provides more flexibility in terms of sentencing, so that the court can either impose a sentence of imprisonment or a fine or a sentence of community work. And it does make that differential between offences committed by companies, which have more than twice the penalty that individuals are subject to, and that's put in the bill as well. But, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to encourage the Minister, Honourable Nick Smith, because he's making or proposing changes to the Conservation Act later this year, that we encourage him to take a similar approach to Jackie Dean, and that's to do some useful tinkering with the legislation. Because where this government does more than tinker with our conservation and environmental legislation, it is a disaster. And we would like to see the Minister copy Jackie Dean rather than his colleague Amy Adams with her sweeping changes to the Resource Management Act, because that tilts the playing field against nature and in favour of development. And where the government has made major changes, as to the RMA and as it's proposing to do in the third tranche of changes to the RMA, to the Crown Minerals Act, where it's given the Minister of Energy a joint decision-making power on applications to access conservation land for mining, we have seen the balance go against nature. So useful tinkering, yes; sweeping changes, no. And that's because, Mr Speaker, we also need the same sort of cross-party agreement that we've seen on this bill around any further changes to conservation legislation, because the Minister holds those lands in trust for all New Zealanders, both now and future generations. And it's not just 20 or 30 years hence, it's 200, 300 years hence. They are common resources that we all have a stake in. So it's much better where we can get the agreement across the Parliament on what changes should be made to the legislation which influences how these wild places, landscapes, Indigenous plants and wildlife are cared for, than if we have the more normal adversarial debate on legislation. Because that cross-party agreement that we've got in this bill acknowledges that collective interest that we have. And it's also a basis for much better lawmaking, because this bill will endure past this government because it has the support of all the parties in the House. But, Mr Speaker, as Ruth Dyson noted, while this bill is about improving protection for certain species, it's very much at odds with what is happening with the Department of Conservation, with the major restructuring we have seen in response to the $54 million cut in its funding over 4 years that this government introduced. In just this year, we've seen 110 jobs lost, and we have seen a decline in morale, huge churn in the department as a result of the restructuring and some new wave management theory about how the department should be organised, which has managers in one location reporting or being responsible for staff in another location hundreds of kilometres away. And so we've seen staff voting with their feet, the department hemorrhaging the people with professional skills, expertise, dedication and commitment to our threatened species, just leaving in droves. There's been a huge overshoot in this restructuring. There are 250 vacancies as of last Friday that the department has yet to fill. That's a huge loss of expertise. So if this government wants to do more than ensure that wildlife smugglers and those that harass marine mammals are effectively prosecuted and penalised, if it really wants to improve the prospects for our threatened species like kiwi and kokako and our native fish, then it's got to better fund the department so we can better look after the species and the habitats and ecosystems that they are part of. If the government genuinely wants to do something about conservation, then it's got to make more decisions like the one that the Minister made on the Rootburn Tunnel to protect the National Park, and it's got to make fewer decisions or no decisions like the Denniston one, where we see a coal plateau damaged and the climate change contributed to by the emissions that will be associated with that mining. So the Minister has a choice on things like the monorail in Southland to protect Snowdon Forest, and it would be a gross injustice if this bill, which increases the penalties for cutting down a single tree on conservation land, goes ahead, and yet the Minister authorises the destruction of thousands of trees, old growth red beech and silver beech forest in Snowdon Forest, for the very financially risky and very destructive Riverstone Holdings monorail application. So, Mr Speaker, it's not enough just to increase the penalties for smuggling wildlife. There's got to be a real commitment to the protection of our Indigenous plants, wildlife and habitats.
Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr